It's going to pick up at the tank where the fuel is stored. Now the filters in the tank may or may not be serviceable depending on which version and vintage you have. Flow from there through the horizontal fuel conditioning module. The horizontal conditioning module is going to give us our water separation and our first major filtering. Then it flows onto the secondary fuel filter housing. We're going to regulate the pressure. And then on to the injectors. So this is how we're going to get our low pressure fuel to the injectors. Let's walk through some of the details. Well, first of all, these are vehicles that go hundreds of thousands of miles, so they get to have significant age on them. And sometimes we have rust like you have in the tank here. Sometimes it can be caused by using the wrong additives that attack the metals. The fuel pressure has been changed on a lot of these vehicles. Early on it was 45 to 55 psi, but a lot of our technicians report they want to see the improved fuel pressure released by a new fuel pressure release spring, which will raise it to 60 and some say 70 psi. They like this because it gives them more reliable fuel delivery. We'll talk more about that in detail. Ford has released an updated fuel pressure kit with a blue spring. We'll see more about that in a little while. But I want to tell you, don't be confused if you hear people say they want to see 60 psi oil pressure. Other people say they're willing to see anything over 45. There are different specifications. Fuel flow is going to leave our tank coming through this filters here to take out the preliminary large sediment that collects in the tank. Now these may or may not be serviceable. Here's the ones we use. They're very small. You can see the big chunks of rust we got out of that dirty fuel tank. It goes into the horizontal fuel conditioning module. Conditioning meaning it's going to warm the fuel, it's going to filter the fuel, and it's going to separate the water. Three functions of the horizontal fuel conditioning module. Warm the fuel up, separate it from the water, and filtering. From here, we're going to send the excess cool fuel. We're going to recirculate it till it gets warm. When we finally get it warm, it begins to recirculate after 50 degrees Fahrenheit. We will send it back to the tank to warm up everything. This is done preliminarily to reduce the amount of waxing and cold filter problems running to. So this blue line leading out to the right goes to our secondary filter housing. We're going to talk a lot about that secondary filter housing as we go through this program. After it's conditioned, heated, filtered, water separated, the clean, pressurized fuel is sent to the secondary fuel housing. After the secondary fuel housing, fuel flows to the cylinder heads past some check valves because it's a deadhead system. As the fuel flows to the passages in each of the cylinder heads to the injectors. Once the cylinder is past the check valve, it does not return to the fuel supply system. This is why we call it a deadhead system. Secondary fuel filter housing contains a high-pressure fuel regulator and air bleed. It regulates the pressure by routing unfiltered fuel from the filter housing back to the horizontal fuel control module via a spring-loaded poppet valve. Here is on the right, with the red circle, is our secondary fuel filter. After we leave the horizontal fuel conditioning module, we come to this line here, the fuel inlet, coming into our secondary fuel filter. We're looking at the end view of it right now. This is our filter return after our pressure regulator, sending it back to the horizontal fuel conditioning module. To the left over here is indicating it's going to the right head from the driver's perspective, and this is going to the left head. This is our fuel pressure test point here. It's located right by our fuel pressure regulator. We're going to talk about that fuel pressure regulator. This port is what it looks like when we remove it. You can install an adapter. We've removed the cover here. We'll show you what's inside the cover. We have had some technicians like Glenn Young down in Houston that made his own test arrangement and putting in his own special adapter for fuel pressure. Makes it much easier, particularly on things like an E-van. This is our pressure regulator. This is what right here is where it's located, and this is what it looks like when the cover is taken off. Make sure the O-ring's in good shape. What's going to happen is this poppet valve is going to open to allow pressure to come out. Now that particular poppet valve happens to be from a 7.3, but it doesn't matter. Here's a close-up of the spring and the poppet valve. Ford and International have released updated versions. Notice the blue spring is much larger than the older spring. This gives us an increased fuel pressure. There's the Ford part number, the international part number, and a different part number for the E-vans. This raises our fuel pressure to over 60 pounds per square inch instead of the 45 to 55. This gives us more room for fuel delivery, and we'll talk about the importance of that later on. We talk about the injectors. But here's the top of our secondary fuel filter. It's got a nice square drive, and most people think you're going to take a square drive and take it loose to take the filter out. Well, not necessarily. What's better is to take a socket and remove it. The square drive will simply wallow it out and cause a problem. So take the filter out, drain it all out, and make sure we have a good clean filter. If we don't have clean material coming in, go backwards from the system here and find out why you've got contamination. Because coming in here is going to be our inlet fuel over here, going around and returning to the horizontal fuel conditioning module here. This is unfiltered, so dirt and contamination and water here sends us back to the horizontal fuel conditioning module and the fuel tank. Once we have this done, there's our pressure regulator. We're going to send this pressure off to our one-way check valve mounted on the head. On each head, we have a check valve. Now notice in the upper right, this is a check valve. Once we put pressure in, we don't allow it to come back out. The 6.4 has a very similar looking bolt in, but that's not a check valve. It simply passes through. Once we get the fuel, it flows into the channels inside the heads to each of the injectors. This channel is sealed off by two O-rings there you see on the injector itself. So once we have it here, by the time it gets here, we have been through the in-tank filter screen. We've been through the tank filters. We've been through the horizontal fuel conditioning module, separating water, separating out any more contamination. In the secondary fuel filter, we've regulated. So right now, we should have a steady, regulated supply of fuel. Next, we're going to go through each of these components and talk in detail about what's going on in each of them so you have a complete understanding of what's happening.